Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The bus screeched to a halt at the corner of Jefferson Avenue and Elmwood Street. Its doors, groaning like a machine bearing the weight of its years, swung open to reveal a gathering of weary passengers. The city's relentless rhythm was etched onto their faces, single mothers clutching children, laborers with calloused hands, and students with bags slung over their shoulders. Among them was a man who moved with the slow deliberation of age. Isaiah Cole, an elderly black man, climbed aboard. He wasn't a commanding figure at first glance, standing a modest 5 feet and 8 inches tall. His frame, though slightly hunched with age, hinted at the strength he once carried. His ebony skin was weathered and taut over his high cheekbones, a testament to years lived under the sun and in struggle. He wore a simple ensemble, a flat cap, a well-loved leather jacket, and khakis. The varnish on his wooden cane gleamed faintly under the fluorescent lights of the bus, polished by decades of use. In his other hand, he held a modest grocery bag, its contents whispering of a man who lived simply. Isaiah's eyes scanned the crowded bus for a seat, not with impatience, but with the quiet acceptance of someone accustomed to the small inconveniences of life. His gaze landed on an empty seat toward the back. Moving deliberately, he shuffled past the passengers, ignoring their disinterested glances. Each step of his leather shoes echoed softly on the metal floor, a sound swallowed by the bus's ambient hum. As he sat down, resting his cane against his knee, a group of teenagers in the corner erupted into raucous laughter. They were a group of 5, each dressed in the urban uniform of the day, hoodies, sneakers, and jeans sagging just low enough to toe the line of rebellion. Their leader, a tall boy with a cocky grin and a snapback tilted precariously on his head, looked around for entertainment. His name was Trevor, and he lived for the rush of commanding attention. Around him, his crew egged him on, their bravado feeding off one another's energy. "Check out Grandpa over there," Trevor said, his voice carrying above the dull drone of the engine. He jabbed a thumb toward Isaiah. The others snickered, nudging each other and exchanging looks that said they knew where this was going. Isaiah remained still, his head slightly bowed as if shielding himself from their taunts. But those who knew him well would recognize the faint tightening of his jaw, a signal of patience wearing thin. He had faced far worse in his lifetime. "Yo, old man," Trevor called out, leaning forward to close the gap between their seats. "You lost? This ain't the nursing home shuttle." Isaiah didn't respond. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small pocket watch, its golden surface scratched, but still functional. He flipped it open and studied the time with an unbothered calm, an action that only seemed to fuel Trevor's antics. "Look at that antique," one of the boys said, nudging Trevor. "Bet that thing was around before World War II. Isaiah finally looked up, his gaze sharp and piercing in a way that seemed to strip the boys of their bravado for a fleeting moment. His eyes carried the weight of someone who had seen more than they could comprehend. It wasn't fear or anger that shone in his expression, but a quiet challenge. Trevor laughed, though it was slightly forced now. "Man, you better keep that thing close. Someone might snatch it." "Respect is free, son," Isaiah said, his voice deep and measured, with a gravelly undertone that hinted at stories untold. It wasn't a plea or a rebuke, just a statement of fact. The teenagers hesitated. The tone of his voice, calm but commanding, created a fissure in their confidence. But Trevor wasn't ready to back down. "Oh, you got jokes, huh?" Trevor sneered, standing up. He took a few steps closer, the swagger in his walk amplified by the cheers of his friends. "Why don't you tell me what you know about respect?" Isaiah leaned back in his seat, folding his arms across his chest. "More than you're ready to learn." The tension in the bus thickened. Passengers stole glances at the unfolding scene, some whispering among themselves. But no one intervened. Most were too weary to step into what they assumed would be another exchange of words that would fizzle out. Trevor's eyes narrowed. "You think you're tough, huh? What, you used to be a boxer or something? Bet you can't even throw a punch anymore." Isaiah gave a low chuckle, one that sounded like the rumble of distant thunder. "Boy, let me give you some advice. When you're picking a fight, make sure you know who you're dealing with." The bus hit a pothole, jostling its passengers and breaking the tense silence. Trevor's friends urged him on, chanting his name under their breath. But there was something about Isaiah's composure that unnerved Trevor, though he couldn't put his finger on it. "Whatever, old man," Trevor said, retreating to his seat but not without adding, "just don't break a hip trying to act tough." Isaiah turned his gaze back to the window, seemingly unfazed. But in that moment, a flicker of something deeper passed across his face. Memories, perhaps, of another time when he had faced down adversaries with far more at stake. As the bus continued its journey, the seeds of a lesson were quietly being sown, one that would leave a mark far deeper than Trevor and his friends could imagine. This was not the end of the encounter, it was merely the beginning. The hum of the bus engine grew louder as it weaved through the congested streets. Outside the fogged windows, the city unfolded in muted tones, neon signs flickering against gray skies, pedestrians rushing past storefronts, and the faint aroma of roasted peanuts wafting from a street vendor's cart. Inside, the atmosphere was charged. Trevor and his crew continued their low, mocking laughter, though their earlier bravado had dimmed slightly. Isaiah remained in his seat, his gaze fixed on the horizon beyond the window, as if peering into something only he could see. Trevor, still nursing the sting of Isaiah's calm retort, couldn't let it go. It wasn't just about impressing his friends anymore, it was about reclaiming his pride. He drummed his fingers against his knee, his mind racing for a way to reassert control. Isaiah's unflinching demeanor gnawed at him. How could an old man who looked like he should be leaning on his cane for dear life hold his ground so effortlessly? Isaiah, for his part, seemed untouched by the buzzing energy around him. He shifted slightly, adjusting the cane resting against his knee. The movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial, like a soldier repositioning his weapon. There was a quiet authority about him that the other passengers began to notice. Those who had initially looked away from the unfolding scene now found themselves drawn back to the old man. Trevor leaned over to one of his friends, a wiry boy named Malik, and whispered something that drew snickers from the group. With a nod from Trevor, Malik rose from his seat and approached Isaiah. "Yo, Pops," Malik began, his tone dripping with mockery. "What's in the bag?" "Bet it's some of that old people stuff, prunes and denture cream, right?" Isaiah didn't flinch. Slowly, he turned his head to meet Malik's gaze. His eyes, deep and piercing, seemed to bore straight into the younger boy's soul. "In my bag?" Isaiah repeated, his voice calm but firm. "Groceries. Bread, eggs, a little coffee. Simple things." "Sounds boring," Malik said, trying to recover his confidence. "Maybe you ought to spice things up, old man. Live a little before you kick the bucket." Isaiah smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hinted at knowledge Malik couldn't begin to grasp. "Living isn't about what's in your bag, son. It's about what you carry in here." He tapped his chest lightly, just over his heart. The response caught Malik off guard. He stammered for a moment, unsure how to respond, before retreating to his seat under Trevor's expectant glare. Trevor stood again, rolling his shoulders as if preparing for a confrontation. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that the situation was escalating. A young woman clutching a toddler shifted uncomfortably in her seat, while an older man wearing a construction helmet muttered something under his breath. "You're full of advice, huh?" Trevor said, stepping closer to Isaiah. "You think you're some kind of wise old sage or something?" Isaiah finally straightened in his seat, his movements slow but deliberate. He placed his cane across his lap, his fingers brushing the worn wood with a familiarity that suggested it was more than just a walking aid. "Not a sage," Isaiah replied, his voice steady. "Just a man who's lived long enough to know what matters." Trevor scoffed, though there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "And what matters, huh? You gonna tell me some Hallmark card nonsense about love and kindness?" Isaiah chuckled softly, the sound low and rich, like a distant drumbeat. "Respect," he said. "Respect matters. For yourself and for others. Without it, you're just wandering, lost. Trevor sneered. Man, don't preach to me. You don't know me. You don't know what I've been through. You're right, Isaiah said, nodding slightly. I don't know you. But I know the world. And I've seen enough to recognize when someone's trying too hard to prove something. Trevor's jaw tightened. His friends were watching, waiting for him to make a move. The tension was palpable now, hanging heavy in the confined space of the bus. You think you're so smart, huh? Trevor snapped. You don't know a damn thing about me. Isaiah leaned forward slightly, his gaze never wavering. Then tell me, son. What do I need to know? The challenge hung in the air, daring Trevor to respond. For a moment, the teenager faltered, his bravado cracking under the weight of Isaiah's calm intensity. But he quickly masked it with anger. Man, forget you, Trevor muttered, shoving past Isaiah's seat to return to his corner of the bus. Isaiah watched him go, his expression unreadable. He leaned back in his seat, adjusting his cane once more. The bus rumbled on, the cityscape outside blurring into a wash of lights and shadows. But the encounter wasn't over. Trevor's pride wouldn't let it end so easily. He whispered furiously to his friends, gesturing toward Isaiah. Malik hesitated, glancing nervously at the old man, but the others nodded, their youthful arrogance outweighing their caution. As the bus slowed to a stop at another corner, Trevor and his crew made their move. They surrounded Isaiah's seat, their bodies forming a loose semicircle. The other passengers shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others gripping their belongings tightly. What's your problem, old man? Trevor demanded, his voice louder now, demanding attention. You think you're better than us? Isaiah looked up, his expression calm but firm. I don't think I'm better than anyone. But I won't let you disrespect me. Trevor laughed, though it was a hollow sound. Disrespect you? Man, you're just an old dude on a bus. What makes you so special? Isaiah didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. He held it up for Trevor to see. The image was grainy, black and white, depicting a younger Isaiah in military fatigues, standing with a group of soldiers in front of a makeshift camp. I'm not special, Isaiah said quietly. But I've stood for something. I've fought for something. And I've lost more than you can imagine. Trevor stared at the photograph, his bravado faltering again. His friends exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how to react. You were in the military? Malik asked, his voice softer now. Isaiah nodded. Vietnam. I was just a kid, not much older than you. I thought I was invincible, thought the world owed me something. But war has a way of teaching you what really matters. The bus was silent now, the tension replaced by a heavy stillness. Even Trevor seemed unsure of himself, his earlier confidence eroded by Isaiah's calm dignity. You don't know what it's like, Trevor muttered, though his voice lacked its earlier fire. You don't know what it's like growing up here, fighting every day just to survive. Isaiah's eyes softened, and for the first time, his voice carried a note of compassion. I do know, son. I know what it's like to fight battles you didn't choose, to feel like the world is against you. But you don't have to let it make you bitter. You can be better than that. Trevor looked away, his jaw tight. His friends shifted awkwardly, unsure whether to stay or retreat. Isaiah leaned back in his seat, tucking the photograph into his pocket. Respect is a choice, he said. And it starts with respecting yourself. The way you carry yourself, the way you treat others, it all comes back to you, one way or another. For a moment, Trevor said nothing. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back to his seat. His friends followed, their earlier bravado completely extinguished. The bus continued its journey, the air noticeably lighter now. Passengers exchanged glances, some nodding subtly at Isaiah, as if acknowledging his quiet triumph. Isaiah closed his eyes, resting his head against the window. Outside, the city rolled on, indifferent to the small but significant battle that had just been won. Inside, a lesson had been planted, one that would linger long after the bus reached its destination. The journey wasn't just about reaching a physical place. For some, it was about discovering a path forward, one paved with respect, humility, and the courage to be better. The bus rolled on through the city, its passengers wrapped in their own thoughts after the tense encounter. Trevor sat slouched in his seat, arms folded tightly across his chest. His mind churned, replaying Isaiah's words over and over, though he tried to brush them off. Respect. Choice. The words gnawed at him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He had grown up in a world where respect was something you took, not something you gave freely. It was earned by being the loudest, the toughest, the one nobody dared to challenge. But Isaiah's calm strength, his refusal to back down without resorting to anger or violence, had shaken Trevor's understanding of what power really meant. Isaiah, meanwhile, sat quietly in his seat, his cane resting against his knee once more. He stared out the window, though his focus wasn't on the city rushing past. His thoughts drifted to the past, to moments he rarely allowed himself to revisit. The young men on the bus reminded him of faces he had once known, brothers in arms, friends who had been just as full of bravado and fire before the realities of life had stripped it away. He had been like Trevor once, brash and unyielding. When he was barely 18, he had enlisted in the army, not out of patriotism, but out of a desperate need to escape. The streets of his neighborhood had been no kinder than the ones Trevor now navigated. Violence, poverty, and desperation had been his constant companions, and the military had seemed like a way out, a chance to prove himself. He hadn't anticipated the cost. Isaiah's thoughts lingered on a night in the jungle, deep in Vietnam. The air had been thick with humidity and the acrid stench of gunpowder. His unit had been ambushed, their position overrun in a matter of minutes. He could still hear the chaos, the shouts, the screams, the deafening roar of gunfire. And then, the silence that followed, broken only by the groans of the wounded. He had survived, though he wasn't sure why. He had dragged himself through the aftermath, carrying the weight of loss that never truly left him. The faces of those he couldn't save haunted him, their voices echoing in his dreams. But it was in those darkest moments that he had learned the value of respect, not the kind that came from fear or dominance, but the quiet, unshakable respect born from understanding and compassion. A sudden jolt snapped Isaiah out of his reverie. The bus had hit another pothole, and the passengers shifted in their seats. He glanced around, his sharp eyes taking in the scene. Trevor's crew had gone quiet, their earlier bravado replaced by a tense unease. The other passengers were stealing glances at Isaiah, as if silently thanking him for standing his ground. Trevor, however, was far from settled. His mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. On one hand, he wanted to dismiss Isaiah's words as the ramblings of an old man who didn't understand what it was like to grow up in a world where survival often meant taking what you could. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was truth in what Isaiah had said. As the bus slowed to a stop at a red light, Trevor glanced out the window. His reflection stared back at him, distorted by the grime on the glass. For the first time, he saw something in his own eyes that unsettled him. Doubt. The confidence he had always relied on, the shield he wore to protect himself from the world, felt cracked. He turned to look at Isaiah, who was sitting calmly, his hands resting lightly on his cane. There was no smugness in the old man's demeanor, no trace of triumph or gloating. He wasn't looking for validation or an audience. He simply existed in his own quiet strength, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos Trevor was used to. Something in Trevor shifted. He didn't know what it was, maybe curiosity, maybe a sliver of respect he wasn't ready to admit. But he found himself leaning forward, his voice low and hesitant. "Hey, old man," Trevor said, his tone lacking the edge it had carried before. "You really think all that respect stuff matters? Out here, I mean. It's not the same as whatever world you grew up in." Isaiah turned to face him, his expression thoughtful. "You're right," he said after a moment. "The world changes. But people don't. The need for respect, for connection, that's universal. It doesn't matter where you are or what time you're living in. It's what keeps us human. Trevor frowned, his brow furrowed. But what if nobody gives it to you? What if all you get is people trying to step on you? Isaiah leaned back slightly, his fingers brushing the worn surface of his cane. That's the hard part, he admitted. Respect doesn't always come easy. Sometimes, you have to give it first, even when it's not given back. That's what makes it powerful. It's not about weakness, it's about strength. The kind that doesn't need to prove itself. Trevor stared at him, his mind wrestling with the idea. He had spent his whole life believing that strength was about dominance, about making others fear you. The idea that strength could come from something as simple, and as difficult, as respect, was foreign to him. The bus began to slow again, pulling up to another stop. A young boy, no more than 9 or 10, climbed aboard with his mother. The boy was carrying a basketball, his face lighting up with excitement as he talked animatedly about a game he had played earlier. Isaiah's eyes softened as he watched them, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. Trevor noticed the change in Isaiah's expression and followed his gaze. "What are you smiling at?" he asked, his tone more curious than confrontational. "Just life," Isaiah said simply. "The little things. Like that boy and his mother. It's easy to miss them when you're caught up in the noise. But those moments, they're what matter in the end." Trevor didn't respond, but he found himself watching the boy as he and his mother found seats near the front of the bus. The boy's laughter was infectious, and for a moment, Trevor felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name. The bus continued its journey, the cityscape outside growing darker as evening approached. The hum of the engine and the occasional chatter of passengers filled the silence, but the tension that had gripped the bus earlier was gone. Trevor sat quietly, his mind churning. He didn't fully understand what he was feeling, but he knew that something inside him had shifted. Isaiah's words had planted a seed, though Trevor wasn't sure what would grow from it. Isaiah, for his part, remained quiet. He didn't press Trevor for a response or try to lecture him further. He understood that change didn't happen overnight. It was a process, one that required time and reflection. As the bus approached another stop, Isaiah stood, gripping his cane firmly as he prepared to disembark. He turned to Trevor, his eyes meeting the young man's with a steady gaze. "Take care of yourself, son," Isaiah said, his voice carrying a weight that Trevor couldn't ignore. "And remember, the choices you make now will shape the man you become." Trevor nodded slightly, though he didn't trust himself to speak. Isaiah gave him a small, knowing smile, before turning and stepping off the bus. The doors closed behind him, and the bus rumbled on. Trevor watched Isaiah's figure grow smaller through the window until it disappeared entirely. For the first time in a long time, Trevor felt a flicker of something he hadn't expected, hope. And though he didn't fully understand it yet, he knew that the encounter with the quiet, unyielding old man had left a mark on him, one that would stay with him long after the bus ride ended. The bus hummed along as the night crept in, casting long shadows over the streets outside. Trevor sat back in his seat, his gaze fixed out the window, but his mind was elsewhere, on Isaiah, on the old man's words that had stuck to him like dust, settling deep within the crevices of his thoughts. The bus continued its route, but for Trevor, the ride had shifted from a simple commute to something far more complex. The city's skyline gleamed under the streetlights as they passed, but Trevor barely noticed. He was too wrapped up in the restless churn of his thoughts. He tried to shake off the disquiet Isaiah had planted in him, tried to bury the uneasy feeling that had crept into his chest. He had never been the kind of guy to second-guess himself, to wonder if he could have done things differently, but today was different. Isaiah had made it look so easy, so effortless, to stand his ground, to be calm in the face of mockery and disrespect. Trevor had expected the old man to fight back, to curse or shout, to make some grand gesture of defiance. But instead, Isaiah had met him with quiet strength, an unspoken challenge that had somehow disarmed Trevor completely. He wasn't sure what had happened on that bus, but the encounter had shaken him in ways he wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just the way Isaiah had stood up to him. It was the way he had made Trevor feel small, not by insulting him or belittling him, but by simply showing him what true strength looked like. Isaiah hadn't needed to say much to make his point. His words had been simple, but they were like a slap to Trevor's face, a wake-up call to the fact that he had been living his life wrong, riding through it with the wrong kind of confidence, built on arrogance and bravado. The more Trevor thought about it, the more he realized how much he had been hiding behind the image he had created for himself, tough, untouchable, the kind of guy who demanded respect, not by earning it, but by forcing it. He thought back to his friends, the ones who had laughed with him on the bus, egging him on. They were all the same, posturing, trying to prove something. But in Isaiah's presence, their noise had seemed hollow, insignificant. Trevor knew that if he were to face Isaiah again, he would have to be someone different, someone more honest, more real. It was a sobering realization. He had spent so much time pretending to be someone he wasn't, hiding behind a mask, and for what? To fit in? To avoid feeling weak? The questions gnawed at him, but they were the kind of questions that didn't have easy answers. And yet, despite the discomfort, despite the unraveling of everything he had ever known, something within him yearned to understand. He felt a strange pull, a desire to be better, to change, to find out what Isaiah had meant when he talked about respect, the kind that was born not from power but from something deeper, something more enduring. Trevor's mind wandered back to his home. His mother, as tough as she was, had always told him to stand up for himself. She had warned him to never let anyone walk all over him, and he had taken that advice to heart. It had served him well on the streets, in the classroom, in his social circles. But that kind of attitude, fighting fire with fire, always being on the defensive, had only kept him locked in a cycle of conflict. It had made him feel alive, sure, but it had also made him feel empty, like something was always missing. Isaiah had cracked open something inside him, something he wasn't sure how to fix. By the time the bus reached his stop, Trevor was a man caught between two worlds, one foot in the life he had always known, and one foot teetering on the edge of something new, something unknown. He stepped off the bus and walked down the street, the cool night air biting at his skin. But the chill wasn't enough to numb the storm that raged within him. He barely noticed where his feet were taking him, his thoughts spinning as he passed familiar buildings, his apartment complex, the corner store, the park where he used to hang out with his friends. The streets felt different tonight, as if the city had transformed into something unfamiliar, something he could no longer fully understand. He found himself walking to the small diner a few blocks down from his place, the one he always passed on his way home but never went into. It was a quiet spot, tucked between a pawn shop and a laundromat, a place he'd always thought of as too ordinary for his taste. But tonight, the idea of quiet, of something simple and unpretentious, appealed to him. The bell above the door jingled softly as Trevor entered. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few late-night patrons sitting in booths near the back. The waitress, a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a name tag that read Evelyn, gave him a warm smile as he approached the counter. "You're new here," she said, her voice gentle, but there was a knowing in her eyes that made Trevor pause. It was the same kind of knowing he had seen in Isaiah's gaze earlier. "What can I get you, hon?" Trevor hesitated for a moment, then slid onto one of the stools. "Just a coffee," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Evelyn nodded, pouring a cup of coffee from a pot that had been sitting on the counter for far too long. She placed it in front of him without a word, and Trevor took a long sip. The bitterness of the coffee hit him immediately, but it was somehow comforting. It was a grounding feeling, something solid in the midst of all the uncertainty. "Long night?" Evelyn asked, her voice soft as she wiped down the counter. "Yeah, you could say that," Trevor replied, glancing down at his coffee. He wasn't sure why he was even talking to her, he wasn't the type to open up to strangers. But something about the diner, the quiet, the simplicity of it all, made him feel like he could let his guard down for once. "I met someone today," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "An old man." "I don't know, he said some things that made me think." Evelyn didn't look at him right away, but she kept wiping the counter. Sometimes, it's the quiet ones who have the most to say, she said. Her words seemed to carry weight, as though they had been spoken many times before. What did he say to you? Trevor took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. He told me that respect isn't something you demand. That it's something you give, even when it's not given back. He said the world doesn't owe you anything, but you can choose to live with respect, even if nobody else does. Evelyn nodded slowly, her hand still moving across the counter. Sounds like he knows what he's talking about. Life can be real tough sometimes, kid. And we all think we know how to deal with it. We try to protect ourselves, make sure we don't get hurt. But in the end, it's how we treat others that matters. That's what sticks with us. Trevor felt a strange weight lift from his chest as he listened to her words. He wasn't sure why, but they felt like a piece of the puzzle falling into place. Maybe Isaiah had been right. Maybe he had been going about his life all wrong, chasing respect in all the wrong ways. But what if respect wasn't about fighting for it? What if it was about living in a way that earned it without trying? What if the answer wasn't in taking, but in giving? Evelyn poured him another cup of coffee, then leaned against the counter. You know, she said, with a soft smile, sometimes we have to unlearn the things we've been taught. And sometimes, it takes someone else, someone unexpected, to show us the way. Trevor nodded, lost in thought. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was just going through the motions. He felt open. Vulnerable, yes, but also hopeful. The world had always seemed like a battleground, a place where only the strongest survived. But maybe there was more to life than winning. Maybe true strength lay in the way you carried yourself, in the way you treated others, even when you didn't have to. Thanks, he said quietly, his voice sincere. I think I needed to hear that. Evelyn smiled again, a warm, knowing smile. We all do, hon, we all do. As Trevor finished his coffee and stood to leave, he felt a sense of clarity settling over him. The weight of his past, the hardness he had carried for so long, still lingered, but it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like a part of him that could be transformed, if he was willing to let it. He stepped out of the diner and into the cool night, the city stretching out before him, no longer a place to conquer, but a place to navigate with more wisdom, more understanding. And as he walked home, he realized that the journey Isaiah had started on the bus wasn't just about the old man teaching him something, it was about Trevor learning, on his own terms, what it meant to truly live. Trevor awoke, the next morning, with an uneasy sense of purpose, a gnawing feeling that today couldn't be like the days before. The memory of Isaiah lingered like a ghost in his mind, haunting him not with regret but with the weight of possibility. For so long, he had defined himself by his actions, the tough front, the cocky attitude, the constant need to assert his dominance in every situation. But Isaiah's words had challenged him to consider something he'd never dared to before. What kind of man did he really want to be? His friends texted him early, the same group of guys who had been with him on the bus. They were already planning their day, talking about hanging out at the basketball court or scoping out the usual spots. Normally, Trevor would have jumped in, ready to assert himself as the loudest, the boldest, the leader of the pack. But today, their chatter seemed hollow, a reminder of the person he was trying to leave behind. He responded with a quick excuse, something about needing to help his mom with errands, and put his phone down. It wasn't a lie. His mom had mentioned needing groceries earlier in the week, and Trevor decided this was as good a time as any to step up. She was in the kitchen when he came out of his room, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone. "Morning, Ma," he said, his voice softer than usual. She looked up, surprised. "Morning, Trev. You're up early. What's the occasion?" "Just thought I'd help out today," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "You still need groceries?" Her eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to figure out what game he was playing. Trevor wasn't usually this considerate without a reason. But when she saw the sincerity in his expression, her features softened. "Yeah, I do. That'd be nice." The grocery store wasn't far, and Trevor offered to carry all the bags on the way back, ignoring his mom's protests that she could handle some of the load. She chatted about her day, about her coworkers and the neighbors, but Trevor's responses were subdued, his thoughts elsewhere. His mom noticed, but didn't press him. She had learned over the years when to push and when to let him come to her in his own time. After unloading the groceries, Trevor found himself restless again. He grabbed his jacket and headed out without much of a plan. His feet carried him back toward the bus route he had taken the day before, as if some invisible force was pulling him. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, maybe Isaiah, maybe clarity, maybe just something to fill the strange emptiness that had been growing inside him since their encounter. The bus stop at Jefferson Avenue and Elmwood Street was quiet when he arrived, the midday lull leaving the streets mostly empty. He sat on the bench and waited, though he wasn't sure for what. The bus came and went, its passengers climbing on and off without much notice of Trevor sitting there. He watched them with a new perspective, wondering about their lives, their struggles, their stories. He'd never cared much about strangers before, but now he found himself curious. How many of them carried burdens they never spoke of? How many were like Isaiah, quietly strong in ways that didn't demand recognition? After a while, Trevor stood and started walking. The city unfolded before him, familiar and yet somehow different. He passed the park where he and his friends used to hang out, their laughter and shouts echoing faintly in his memory. He passed the corner store where he used to loiter, acting tough and intimidating for no reason other than to prove he could. The streets felt like a timeline of his life, each block a chapter in a story he was beginning to rethink. Eventually, he found himself in a quieter part of town, where small houses with peeling paint and overgrown lawns stood in neat rows. He didn't know why he had come here until he saw Isaiah sitting on the porch of one of the houses, his cane resting against the railing. The old man looked up as Trevor approached, his expression unreadable. "You lost, son?" Isaiah asked, his tone even. Trevor hesitated, his hands shoved deep in his jacket pockets. "No," he said after a moment. I don't know. I guess I wanted to talk." Isaiah regarded him for a long moment before nodding toward the steps. "Well, you're here. Take a seat." Trevor climbed the steps and sat down, the wood creaking slightly under his weight. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, filled with unspoken questions and thoughts. "You're a stubborn one," Isaiah said finally, breaking the silence. "Most people would have brushed off what I said yesterday. Pretended it didn't matter." Trevor shrugged, his gaze fixed on the cracked pavement in front of the house. "I tried," he admitted. "But it's been messing with my head. What you said, it made me think. And I don't like thinking about stuff like that." Isaiah chuckled softly. "That's because thinking leads to change, and change ain't easy. It's easier to stay the same, to keep doing what you've always done, even if it's not getting you anywhere." Trevor nodded slowly. "Yeah. But staying the same, it doesn't feel right anymore. I thought being tough, being loud, was the only way to get respect. But you didn't do any of that. And you made me feel, I don't know, like I wasn't as strong as I thought I was." Isaiah leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Strength ain't about how loud you can be or how much you can take from others. It's about knowing who you are and standing firm in that, no matter what the world throws at you. It's about lifting others up, not tearing them down." Trevor let the words sink in, his chest tightening. "But what if I don't know who I am?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Isaiah glanced at him, his expression softening. "Then you start figuring it out. It's not a race, son. It's a journey. And it's okay to not have all the answers right away. The important thing is that you're asking the questions." They sat in silence for a while longer, the weight of the conversation settling between them. For the first time, Trevor felt a strange sense of peace, as if the pieces of himself that had been scattered for so long were slowly starting to come together. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. When he finally stood to leave, he turned to Isaiah and held out his hand. "Thanks," he said, his voice steady. "For everything." Isaiah shook his hand firmly, a faint smile on his face. "Take care of yourself, Trevor. And remember, the man you choose to be is up to you." Trevor nodded, his chest lighter than it had been in years. As he walked away, the city seemed a little brighter, the streets a little less daunting. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he also knew he wasn't the same person who had stepped onto that bus the day before. He was ready to change. And for the first time, he believed he could.